Good evening. I'm Scott Hemsel from the class of 1985, and I have the honor of chairing the Faculty Pre-Law Committee and introducing our speaker this evening. At Wabash, we seek to educate our students to think critically, act responsibly, lead effectively, and live humanely in a difficult world. Our speaker has done just that. He has lived out the values of our mission statement by successfully battling hate groups in America. After achieving great financial success in publishing, our winner changed course dramatically in 1967 and began to direct his considerable energies to the cause of civil rights, beginning in his native state of Alabama. Through the Southern Poverty Law Center, which he co-founded, Mr. Dees has developed creative and courageous ways to put some of America's most virulent hate groups out of business. He's done so by obtaining very large verdicts in the courtroom, not just against individual wrongdoers, but against the hate groups that sponsored and supported their acts of intimidation, violence, and even death. He has then used those verdicts to take the bank accounts, the compounds, the campgrounds, and even the office furniture and supplies of those hate groups. One goal of Wabash's Senior Peck Medal is to honor such a tremendous achievement by a lawyer. But another goal of the Peck Medal is to inspire our current students and our alumni lawyers by our winner's example. And we could do no better than the example of this year's winner. Please welcome Morris Dees.
Well, I'm not sure the old men here from having moved into a church. But as I was walking over here, I was thinking it kind of reminded me of that little Baptist church that I went to in the small cotton farming community I grew up in Alabama. My Sunday school teacher there, there's only like 75 people in the school across the street there. My Sunday school teacher there was also my 5th and 6th grade teacher in that 3-room school. She taught my dad, she taught me, and she taught 2 of my sons. And I think they closed that little country school to get rid of Miss Vera Bell Johnson. But she taught us in that little church, and she taught us in our Sunday school, and you couldn't tell where one began and the other one ended because we had Bible verses written on the school board in the 1940s. But she wanted us to grow up to be responsible citizens. And she gave us various lessons along the way to help us do that. And there was 2 things that Mrs. Johnson felt that we should definitely not do. And one was we should not smoke cigarettes, and we should not drink alcoholic beverages. And I did great on the first one. And she was serious about these things, I promise you. I can hear her right now. If all of you have had this later for your teacher, you not only would have grown up to be a good citizen, I'm sure, but you never would have smoked a cigarette. There would have been no tobacco litigation because you would have had to say a little rhyme we had to say every day. We had to say that tobacco is a filthy weed, and from the devil does proceed. It picks your pockets and burns your clothes and makes a smokestack of your nose. Now on this drinking note, she was even stronger. She had a button about this big she wore, homemade, never married. And I'm sure that she got this big button in the Prohibition battle because I'm sure that Miss Johnson was leading the troops when they passed that Constitutional Amendment in Montgomery County, Alabama. And on this button it said, "Lips that touch wine shall not touch mine." And one day, you know, I'm 12 years old, I'm the lawyer to be, I'm sitting in there listening to all this temperance stuff. And I said, but Miss Johnson, you told us last week that Jesus in one of his miracles turned water into wine. And she said, yes, Morris, but we'd have thought a whole lot more of him if he hadn't have done that. she led us out in front of that school with the other 2 or 3 teachers every morning, and we put our hands on our hearts and they raised the flag. We pledged allegiance. And I remember the words that she later talked about in class that meant so much to her. Words that have stuck with me from that pledge over the years that probably shaped my life more than any one thing I would know, besides having a good teacher like Ms. Johnson and good parents. One nation with liberty and justice for all. This little lady could do not much about the segregated South we lived in, but she tried to teach us to respect all people. It took a while before one of my neighbors, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, had to rise up and require America to live up to its promises of equality written in our Constitution. It's ironic that we're here on April the 6th. Dr. Martin Luther King was killed on April the 4th in Memphis, Tennessee. And we just celebrated his birthday and African History Month. Dr. King made a very powerful speech the night before he was assassinated in Memphis, and you have to understand, he was not in Memphis, Tennessee, trying to integrate anything. He was there speaking for economic justice for the garbage workers who were making less than $1 an hour, not even a living wage. And in this speech, he said, I've been to the mountaintop. He said, I've seen the promised land. And I might not get there with you. You will. But what I saw was a land of promise, of fairness, and of justice. And we know what Dr. King was talking about. He was talking about Moses and the children of Israel and the promised land that they were seeking after being released as slaves in Egypt, and after traveling from place to place, receiving awful treatment for hundreds of years, and finally they got to the River Jordan. That was Dr. King's reference. And when that band of ex-slaves stood on that river, they looked across from the high bluff vantage point they had, and they saw a different and a strange land. They saw prosperity. They saw people that were different than them. Maybe had had a different education, people that looked different than them. And so they said, okay, now we're here, let's cross. And let's take this promised land that we've been promised, and let's go in. And there's a big dispute broke out. And some of them said, hey, look, you know, those people are different than we are over there. We shouldn't be going over there. Why don't we just stay over here? We're a little bit timid. We don't want to cross this river and get with these strange people. And some of them said, well, you know, why don't we just go back to Egypt, because we know what we had over there. Might have been slaves, but at least we had 4 good meals, 3 good meals a day. Well, you know, they didn't cross that river. They argued among them, and they went back, as the story goes, they wandered 40 more years in the wilderness. Well, isn't it ironic that since Dr. King passed away right at 40 years ago, since we had the Voting Rights March in 1965 that gave African Americans a right to vote, since our Congress decided to pass all these different civil rights laws, that we've basically wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and we've really, as a nation, as a united people, hadn't crossed that river until the election of Barack Obama as president. And it is again ironic that it's 40 years after the death of King that we swore in Barack Obama. And it's so easy for us to look back and say, well, you know, we've taken care of this issue, we've taken care of these human rights and these civil rights, And we look back in history and we talk about the Reverend Dr. King and Rosa Parks and others, and we might maybe feel a little bit easy because we think there's nothing much for us to do, or if it is, it's not easy to see what we should do. But the march for justice continues. It's just as important to those peoples whose rights are being denied today as it was to 10 million African Americans who couldn't vote, who couldn't go in restaurants, buy homes, and who were less than second class. You know what these issues are. These issues deal with things such as systemic built-in bias and prejudice. We elected an African American president, but that doesn't mean that all people of this country of color, and especially those in second-class economic condition, are stand on an equal footing with the rest of us. The University of Chicago, as I told a group of students earlier today on this campus, they sent out several thousand job applications, and on half of those job applications they put an African American sounding name, Lakeisha Washington. And on the other half they put an Anglo sounding name, Emily Brandon. And these job applications were all identical though, the same educational background, the same references, the same experiences, highly qualified if you read the application. And the only difference was just the name. And they sent these to companies seeking employees for various jobs. And it may not surprise some of you here that the Lakeishas got 50% calls from the personnel directors of these companies for further information or to come in for an interview. Somebody opened the gate for the Emilys and shut the gate for the Lakeishas, crippling possibly a good financial and economic future for the Lakeishas and not for the Emilys, and maybe for the Garcias and not for the John Williams. I think you understand what I'm talking about. Those are very difficult, intractable issues to handle. That's probably the most significant civil rights issue we're facing today. Probably the second one deals with Latinos among us. And I put them probably on an equal footing because people of color tend to be treated and lumped together by those of us who hold the power, so to speak. Latinos in America today are millions of people. In fact, they're the largest minority, over 35 million people. And probably 50 years from now might even be a much larger part of our population. And people like myself and many of you will be in a minority around the turn of the century. But today they are the 21st century sharecroppers. And we at the Southern Poverty Law Center are working hard to make sure that companies like Del Monte and those that bring these people in as guest workers treat them fairly and treat them according to the law. You know, those people who hate Americans, and there are many in the world that do for many reasons, they see us as one people. They don't see us as gay and straight, as black and white, Jews, Gentiles, men or women. They see us as Americans with a way of life that's threatening to many people, and that is our multicultural freedoms that we have, freedom of speech and religion, that makes this country a great nation. But yet it's interesting how we here look at each other and our people not as one people, but we see people as gay or straight that cause all kinds of problems, hate crimes. We see people as poor or rich. We see them as black or white, whichever religion or not. We divide ourselves up. You probably remember 9/11 and that horrible day, and you've probably seen repeated over and over and over the incidents where there are people who were inside of the buildings on the 85th and 6th floors where the planes hit, could not stand the heat any longer. And finally, in order to free themselves at least from dying from fire, jumped out the window, and you saw those people going down. And if you took the best magnifying glass that you could find, if you enlarged those photographs as large as you could of those people going down, you couldn't tell whether they were black or white, Jew or Gentile. You couldn't tell anything about them. They were just Americans all merged together in a common tragedy. You know, America is changing. America is not going to go back to the politics that we had before Mr. Obama was elected president. He changed that in so many ways by involving millions of people who had never voted before, but involving technology that we'd never used before, the internet and every other device he could to bring people together. So we're not going to go back to the days of past politics, both Democratic and Republican. We're changing that way, and we have a great opportunity to make progress because of these changes. But America is also changing because we're becoming more diverse. I grew up on that small cotton farm in Alabama, and really there was only two people there, white folks and black folks, and we worked together. The blacks had few or no rights except those that had property, and they fared somewhat better. But that was the only diversity that I knew when I grew up there. And so I didn't really understand America very well. I never traveled outside of my state till I went off to college. But I had a case that really opened my eyes to the fact that America is great because of our diversity and not in spite of it. America is great because of what people from all different walks of life and nations around this world have brought to make this nation what it is. And I learned that by representing a group of Vietnamese fishermen in Galveston Bay, Texas. After the Vietnam War, several 100,000 Vietnamese who fought on our side came to this country. Had they stayed behind, they probably would have been killed for supporting us. And they settled all over this nation. The Catholic Church settled thousands of them and other organizations. These people came with the clothes on their backs with hardly no money. But they came with the willingness to work hard, and about 50,000 of them settled in the Galveston Bay, Texas area. And many of them immediately went to work, and it wasn't long before they'd taken over all kind of businesses. They'd taken over the car wash businesses, a lot of restaurants, fruit stands, flower stores. They were really, really ambitious people. And about 50 of these fishermen down around the Galveston Bay area south of Houston, Texas, decided they wanted to get some shrimping boats, fishing boats, and go out and fish like they'd done in the warm waters around Saigon Harbor and other places. They didn't have money to buy these $200,000 and $300,000 boats that the Americans had. They pooled their funds together and bought $5,000 and $6,000 old boats that were, so many of them, leaking, and they fixed these old boats up and they went out to fish. And it wasn't also long before they were out fishing the American fishermen. They got up early, they stayed out late. The languages are different, but they worked hard and they saved their money. And also it wasn't long before the American fishermen became, I guess there's no better word to say than just jealous. There were 1,200 American fishing boats in those waters up and down the Gulf Coast, and there were 50 of these little boats. And if one of these little boats went by one of those big fishing trawlers, you would think it was almost a canoe going by. They were so small. Well, the American fishermen had an association with lobbyists, and they went to the Texas legislature, and they said, we want you to pass some laws to take these fishing licenses away from these Vietnamese and not issue any more. And the Texas legislature, in its wisdom, said, we can't do this. This is America. It's a free enterprise system. These are our friends. Well, that didn't sit well with the American fishermen, a bunch of them, so they turned to the Ku Klux Klan, America's oldest terrorist group. And they decided that the Klan would harass them, would threaten them, Shrimping season opened about a month from the time they started this campaign. They burned a couple of Vietnamese boats. They burned a big cross and hung a couple of Vietnamese in effigy down in the area. And they promised them in public speeches that if they went out to fish, that the Klan would blow their boats up when they got in the open waters. Well, these Vietnamese were frightened. I mean, they'd seen the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and Vietnam, the terrorists of those places. So they decided that they'd sell their boats. When I got down there to represent them with other lawyers from the Southern Poverty Law Center, I remember walking up and down the harbor in Kemah, Texas. And there were little boats there that you've probably seen in pictures at little wheelhouses, and in the wheelhouses they had little signs you buy in a hardware store that said for sale. And the boats were kind of bobbling there. It was warm in April. And I walked up and down the dock talking with the Vietnamese leaders. One was Nguyen Van Nam. And they were telling me their problems. I said, you know, why don't we bring a lawsuit in federal court? And we'll get an injunction against these these American fishermen and the Klan. And if they violate this federal court injunction, they'll go to court for criminal contempt of court. A lot of legal talk for this person who spoke just broken English, but he says, okay. So we gathered our evidence because we only had 2 weeks before shrimping season opened. And we put together a good case, and that was some American fishermen who liked the Vietnamese. They had known them as individuals, and they had worked with them, and so they became witnesses for us to say, yeah, the Klan threatened us and said that if we worked with them, they'd burn our boats too. That's just the kind of testimony we needed in court. Well, court was to start on Monday morning for a trial that would last a whole week, and I got a call on Sunday night at my hotel room from Nguyen Van Nam. He said, Mr. Dees, drop the lawsuit. I said, oh, Nam, we don't want to drop this lawsuit. We're going to win this case. We have a good case. He said, no, the leaders of the Vietnamese community and the other businesses have told us that we shouldn't agitate these Klansmen. Let them have the fishing. Y'all, we're going to do something else. I said, Nam, look, you think you could get the Vietnamese leaders and the other fishermen and all together somewhere I can speak to them tonight? Because if they say drop the lawsuit, we're out of court tomorrow. I have to tell the judge we have no case because we have no plaintiffs. Later that night, it was about 7 o'clock, I remember, I was in a small Catholic church, a priest standing in front interpreting. About this many people were sitting there in the audience, many with just the clothes they came to Vietnam, from Vietnam in, their Sunday best. And they were sitting there, and I was looking, and I said, you know, listen to me for a moment, folks. I don't want you to drop this lawsuit. Because if you drop this lawsuit, they're going to come after your other businesses. You know, in America, we have laws to protect the minority against the majority if the majority is violating our Constitution and the laws. Don't drop your lawsuit. I said, you may not know this man. His name was Martin Luther King. He was a black minister in the South during the days when his people's rights were violated. Their people were killed, their churches were bombed and burned, they were threatened and shot, but they also stayed in our court system, and they won case after case after case, and had they not had faith in our justice system, they wouldn't have gotten their rights as soon as they did. I left the room, and later that night, after I'm sure a very contentious debate because people were frightened, and I could understand, I got a call from Nguyen Van Nam. He said, Mr. Dees, continue lawsuit. We took the case to court, and we won a good victory. The judge gave us a very strong injunction, naming about 30 individuals and ordering them not to go near the Vietnamese fishermen and to allow them to fish. Fishing and shrimping season opened the next Monday morning after the verdict came in. And I was invited with our other employees, Southern Poverty Law Center people, to come down to Kemah, Texas for the blessing of the fleet. Got down there about daylight. The sun still hadn't come out. Fog was hanging heavy over the bay where Clear Creek Channel comes out into the bay. And there was a Catholic priest standing on the dock. And there were family members and children sit on each side waiting for their loved ones to go out into the open waters in the Gulf to fish and shrimp. And we didn't see any boats, and soon we heard a diesel engine chugging, and one small boat popped out through the fog coming out into the front of the reviewing stand. The priest blessed that boat, and another, until about 15 boats had gone out into the open waters. The sun began to burn through the fog, and I could see, as I looked to my right and my left, I could see the badges glistening off, the sun glistening off the badges of the United States Marshals that had been sent there to protect these fishermen and to enforce this court order. And also, as I looked around me, as these boats went by and people waved and the priest blessed the boats, I could see the pride and happiness in the face of these family members as these new Americans found their place at America's table. Not only just a place at America's table, but building that American table, the economics of our country, for the benefit of all of us. And I'll have to tell you, as I stood there that early morning, I felt not only proud to be a lawyer, I felt proud to be an American, seeing the majesty of our justice system and our way of life at work. You know, today we have over 900 hate groups operating in our country today, many in this state. You can look on our website. These groups don't register down at the Chamber of Commerce, so it's not easy to catch all of them, but we know a lot of them. And you can see the names and what they've done. And we've taken many, many to court over the last few years, and just recently got a $2.3 million verdict down in Brandenburg, Kentucky, right south of Louisville. A hate group, neo-Nazi hate group, Klan group / they hate, whatever you want to call them. They're young people, steel-toed boots, you name it, with chapters in about 25 states at the time. Brutally beat up a little boy they thought was Latino. Actually, he was an American Indian, but he was a little short, dark hair fella. And they kicked him in the head at the county fair simply because they thought he was a Latino migrant. And when the cops came up and arrested two of them, slapped the cuffs on them, one of them turned to the police officer and said, "Why are you arresting me? There's the illegal spick over there on the ground." In other words, it's okay just to kill him. And you know, we've seen this kind of stuff. And we also saw the tragedy of James Byrd being drugged behind a pickup truck down in Texas by a couple of Klan types, and Matthew Shepard taken out and beaten, tied to a fence where he died in Wyoming, a University of Wyoming student, because of his sexual orientation. We've seen all these type hate groups. We saw nooses hung in trees in Jenner, Louisiana. And we looked at it and we said, you know, what's going on in our country today? What's happening? And we've sent people all over this nation. This is about 10 or 15 years ago, actually, we started this project. And we wanted to figure, what can we do to educate young people to accept each other? Educate this country. And so we went to small communities, large communities, campuses, and what we found out, that people all over this country were saying that we are better than those people who do these horrible things. They don't represent us. And we found people and groups and organizations and individuals who were reaching out to victims of hate crimes and saying, we feel your pain. We want you to be a part of us, and we want to be a part of you. And we started our program of acceptance and tolerance then. It's now used in some 80,000 schools in this country, based on the work that we did in the research. Because it's one thing to fight hate in court, but it's much more important to teach acceptance and tolerance in the classroom. Well, when we went around the country, we heard some pretty compelling first-hand account stories of people reaching out to victims of hate crimes and intolerance. And one story came out of Billings, Montana. I remember there, a small town, not many minorities, very few Jewish people. A Jewish family there that had a small son gave him a menorah, the candle holder used during Hanukkah. You know, you light one candle each night of Hanukkah. And this little boy was so proud of this menorah, he placed it on a table in a window that people could see it from the street, and each night of Hanukkah he'd light a candle. And there was a man who saw this menorah lit there one night and didn't like what he saw, and he threw a brick through the window. And there was another man in that town, he wasn't Jewish, and he didn't like what he saw either. And he was a merchant there, and he had the store with it on the marquee, put the advertising for the things he sold. And he took all of his ads down, and in the place of them he put, "Not in our town." And this man got with the schools and the police department, the newspaper and civic organizations, and in support of this little victim of this hate crime, they had cardboard menorahs made to be placed in the windows of every home in Billings. They could get people to put them up, and almost everybody participated. They would face the street to speak out against this hate crime. And one night when this campaign was underway, this mother took her little son out to see. And she and her husband drove him around after supper. And as they drove up one street and down another, they could see these menorahs backlit from the house lights inside. And this little boy was looking with his eyes wide. He said, "Mom, I didn't know so many Jews live in Billings." And she said, "No, son, these are our friends." Therein, I think, lies the answer. When we reach across these divides that separate us in this nation, whether they be lines of sexual orientation or gender or religion or economics and class, those on one side who have wealth and power and those on the other who don't, lines of religion, things that separate us, that create so many hate crimes, it'll be because we learn to accept others who are different than us and learn to appreciate those differences to make this country into a better world and a better nation. And that's a responsibility for each of us, because, you know, we basically sit at the same table with the people who are like us when we have lunch. It's pretty typical most of the places. We have a really very segregated society. I don't mean just along racial lines. Sometimes you have the jocks sitting at this table and the cheerleaders over here and the preppy dresses over here and the different, you know, people segregate themselves. And we end up kind of having a pretty insular view. A university like this, a small college, certainly gives you an opportunity to know people who are different. And I'm sure you work at it all the time. But that's what we're going to have to deal with. Now, we're standing here and we've crossed that River Jordan, so to speak, and this 40 years has passed, so really the ball is in your court. There was a time when the Reverend Dr. King, in a very dark day in the history of this country, wondered if we were going to succeed as a nation. And can you blame him? When his people were treated horribly, brutalized, denied economic opportunities and education, in a nation that promises liberty and justice for all. And this bothered Dr. King, and he told us a story then. He told us an old story. I heard him tell this story as he walked among us. He told us a story about another nation, a nation that no longer existed. A nation in many ways like ours that began with great promise of fairness and justice. But a nation that strayed and no longer lived up to its promises. The year was 900 BC. These Jews we're talking about who had been slaves in Egypt moved into that promised land, and they finally built a great city called a city-state back then. They built high walls to protect it from those who would come in and take what they had. And they had a big gate at the entranceway. And in this city, they had an education system, a banking system, law enforcement, courts, very much like today. And they had a giant marketplace in the center of this town where people brought their goods and produce and things in to sell. People from towns and villages outside of this walled area, and those inside of that town who prospered built big homes overlooking fertile valleys, and they were doing good, many of them. And there was a farmer who got to those gates early in the morning because he was an industrious person and he wanted to get a good stall in the market every week to put his produce out. And as he waited for those big gates to open early in the morning, this farmer saw things that bothered him. He saw able-bodied men and women reaching out begging for a few grains from his wagon. And upon inquiry, he learned that, well, if you wasn't a member of the right group, you didn't get a good job or a job at all to feed your family. And then when he put his produce in the marketplace, he heard grumbling from the people that walked by his stall. And he learned that, well, from overhearing them, that he heard them say, well, you know, unless you're with the right group in this town, when you get arrested, you don't get as good a treatment as the people who control this place. And if you go to court, you don't get a good shot at a fair trial. And this really concerned this farmer because he knew the promise of these people and he knew what they had faced. He was a man of some reputation and means in his small community he came from, and he asked the leaders if he could have a word with them, coming before the governing council, so to speak. Most of you probably know who this farmer was. He was the biblical prophet Amos. And Amos was granted that audience, and he stood before these leaders and he said, look, folks, you got a good thing going here. But unless you're fair to all the people, you're not going to get to keep what you have and pass it down to future generations. Unless you treat people equally and fair, it's going to be taken away from you. And unless you're fair, I predict, Amos said, there won't be one stone left upon another of this great city. And Amos spoke to them in the words that Dr. King spoke to us when he gave us a warning. Amos said, don't be satisfied, folks, until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. That's what it's all about. It's the thing called justice. We didn't parachute in here with what we had that makes us separated from others, our wealth, our family background. Somebody before us worked hard, and you just happen to be a beneficiary of that if you have a lot, and if you don't, you're a beneficiary of that also. But it all starts over with each of us and with each generation of this nation. Dr. Martin Luther King had great faith in us as a people and as a nation. In a very dark time in our country, he had to preach the funeral of the little girls who died in Birmingham in 1963 when Klansmen burned the 16th Street Baptist Church. And I know he must have had a heavy heart, but it wasn't long before he went to Washington, D.C. and stood on the Mall with 250,000 people at his feet and millions watching on television when he said that he believed in us, not just us who were there then, but you who would come in the future. He said that I have a dream that one day in the red clay hills of Georgia, that the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit down around the table of brotherhood. Well, a lot's happened since Dr. King left us. I know he'd be proud today of our political scene, but the issues have changed. We've taken 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. as we tried to realize his dream. But I think if he was here today, and if I might be so bold as to put words in this great American's mouth, he might say that I have a dream that one day in the red clay hills of Georgia, and today he might add in the ghettos, in the barrios, on the reservations, and in the seats of economic and political power in this nation, that the sons and daughters of former slaves and the sons and daughters of former slave owners, and today I think he would add the homeless, the poor, the powerless, and those who hold the keys to the economic and political power of this nation will sit down around the table of personhood and truly learn to love one another. I have great faith, too, in you, the young people of this country, here and all over this nation, to make sure that this second 40 years that we're dealing with here are going to be great. People like you helped elect America's first African-American president. And I feel that when my time has passed and your older people out here have gone, and when you're living out your life in the latter part of this century, one of you, somebody, is going to write a story about your time. Maybe one of you, maybe you'll write the book. And I predict that because you share this passion for justice, that this book will be about, truly, America's greatest generation. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Dees has asked whether we have time for a question or two, and we do just that. So I would ask if anyone has a question, stand and ask. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Sir?
My question for you is, what would you say to students who are advocating for diversity when the resistance seems to use a lot of fancy rhetoric to kind of beat around the bush of the issue, but not really address what's going on in youth diversity in their different spheres?
Give me an example of the kind of rhetoric you're talking about.
Well, for instance, if you address an issue or something, they'll say that they apologize for the inconvenience and it's something that they wish to address, but the times haven't left for them being able to fully address it or to fully impact the issue, I guess.
I'm not sure exactly how to answer that question because there are people who make excuses or who won't confront issues squarely because they're uncomfortable talking about these issues, about diversity, about opportunities for fair and equal treatment and equal action. A good example, I think, was a recent debate we had over something called affirmative action. You know, and that deals with a little bit about diversity, and when people get very uncomfortable, because people say, well, heck, you know, I made the highest grade on this entrance test or this test at the police department, and therefore, you know, I ought to, you know, it's been 40 years since the civil rights movement, and things ought to be equal by now, and heck, you know, why do people want some kind of unfair advantage? Well, you know, as I told you the other day, I got an affirmative action card when I graduated from high school. Actually, I had it when I was born. And I used it at the University of Alabama to get in law school without even getting an undergraduate degree. When I got out of law school, I passed the bar. Pardon me, I didn't take the bar because I didn't have to. I showed them my affirmative action card and I immediately was given my law license. I can go on and on, but the bottom line is my affirmative action card was just the color of my skin. And I got enormous advantages from that. America loves affirmative action. It depends on whose actions are being affirmed. And after World War II, we had a wonderful program that allowed returning GIs, and some 3 or 4 million left, mostly white males. And they went all over the world, and therefore they were disadvantaged when they came home because they didn't have education opportunities while they were gone. But when they came back, they were people, if you wanted to be a fireman, if you wanted to be a civil service worker, you took a test. And on that test, if you were returning GI, you got 10 or 15 bonus points, just simply added to your score. That was an affirmative action program. And so if a person took a test who wasn't a GI, and let's say they made 90 on a test to become a clerk typist or some type of job, fireperson or whatever, and a GI took the test and made 80, the GI got the test with their 15 bonus points added. But you know, we were able to work all that out. You know, fires got put out, police departments, we did well, public, you know, affirmative action only applied to public institutions, it doesn't apply to private stuff. And, you know, things worked out. I think that we have to figure out a way to share all of our prosperity in this country, taking into account all of our people and where everybody came from and what we're trying to get people to do. Uncomfortable subject to talk about, but you have to be careful not to get thrown off by 1 minute and 3 minute television commercials. I think this last election, though, showed us a lot in this nation. And it's interesting, in Alabama, Barack Obama got 10% of the white vote. Gore, who was not nearly as attractive candidate, and the country was not in a horrible economic crisis, got nearly 24% of the white vote. So you can see in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and those other areas, North Florida, that we still have a little bit of this people feeling like, well, Mr. Obama must have gotten where he got because of some kind of affirmative action plan, which, you know, is about as wrong as you could possibly be. You know, he didn't become editor of the Harvard Law Review just because of his race. So those are difficult questions to discuss, and I always say, look, you know, everybody has a right to their own views and opinions. Some come from our parents where we grew up. I grew up on a small cotton farm, and I left there. I was as conservative as you get, you know, and it took me a chance to get out in the world and see how things happen, you know, until I kind of changed my views, you know, real, you know, small agricultural business type person. But, you know, I think there's room for all views in this mix. I do know that that our country is in a horrible economic crisis now, and it wasn't brought on by poor people wanting to get homes and lying about their income. It was a whole lot of other folks in that mix up the ladder who made sure this whole thing worked. And rating companies issuing basically junk mortgages and giving them AAA ratings, you know, so everybody had their fingers in that pie. So, you know, I'm not blaming any past political person, right, left, or center. It's just we got a new start here, and I hope that President Obama is not judged harshly, you know, on everything he does just because of his race. That may well happen, but fortunately he has 4 years to deal with the mess that he was handed. I asked too long of time to answer that one question, but yes, sir. You stand up. I don't hear too good. Speak loud. York, Alabama. All right. I know about Demopolis, yeah. Oh. That's one of the better questions I've heard in a long time. What can we do to deal with the economic disparity along racial lines, class lines, in urban, rural, you name it? That is what I think our leaders in our nation are trying to deal with today. You address those by dealing with, first of all, giving people a decent job, and that takes good education. And it takes people who are healthy working at those jobs. And it probably requires some kind of health care program that takes care of that 40 million people who don't have health care. So when you get an appendicitis operation, like I read the other day, the hospital and doctors bill over $12,000, and this non-insured person filed bankruptcy. We have not the highest longevity rate in the nation, but the most expensive healthcare system that doesn't include most of our people. And yet there are countries in the world that we think of almost third world who have better national healthcare systems. In this country, there's an attitude that, well, you got to take care of your own bills. It's kind of the frontier spirit in America, like, well, it's your problem. If you can't make the money to buy your health insurance, we're not going to buy it for you. And it's an attitude that grew up in this country that's almost alien to the United States only. Other countries in the world don't seem to have this attitude. Starting with good health care, education systems that really do educate people, with teachers who are really dedicated, and then putting people in decent homes. My business partner growing up in college, who I practiced law with for 10 years, had that goal, and that was fair housing. Adequate housing for people, not fair, but adequate, decent homes. He passed away about a month ago. His name was Millard Fuller. He founded Habitat for Humanity. And they built over 300,000 houses where people could live in a decent home. And I think that's important, because when I went to his dedication, to his memorial service in Atlanta about 3 weeks ago, a young man stood up and said that he was one of the people that spoke there. He said that he and his mother, a single mother, had a Habitat home for them built. It must have been 15 years or so before. And he said that, it rained in our house, and he said they built up on the walls because the house was in such horrible condition. He said, we froze in the wintertime, and sometimes, you could just look through the walls to the outside. He said, we were all failing in school. We had no pride. And said that, that they moved into the house. It was the greatest day in their life. Habitat's houses, people work on themselves. They put some sweat equity in, and they pay the principal off with no interest. And these are fine homes. And excuse me. And this young man said that he was proud to tell the group there that he was going to graduate from Harvard Medical School. So I think it's willingness to lift all of our people up together, giving everybody a fair and equal chance to prove their natural ability, that's going to make us a greater nation. Thank you.
Mr. Dees, thank you again very much for visiting with us this afternoon. I want to invite those of us who are staying on for the Peck dinner to make your way over to Dutchin for our reception, which starts now, and for our dinner that follows. Thank you again for coming.